In the vast farmland of Nebraska where time seems to move with the seasons. Single act of kindness would alter 2 lives forever. Hungry and near bankruptcy, Henry Coleman gave his last meal to a 12-year-old boy stranded in a blizzard, never expecting to see him again 15 years later as the elderly farmers. It's at his kitchen table staring at a final foreclosure notice. The rumble of expensive vehicles approaching his property signals an unexpected visitor. The boy he once saved has returned now, a billionaire CEO. What happens next will stun the small town of Millfield and prove that sometimes in moments of our greatest desperation, the seeds of kindness we plant return in ways we could never imagine. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The winter of 2010 had been particularly cruel to Millfield, Nebraska. 3 consecutive seasons of drought had been, followed by record-breaking snowfall, burying the already struggling farming community under 6 ft of snow and temperatures that plunged well below zero. For Henry Coleman, a 67-year-old and 3rd-generation farmer, the harsh weather was merely the latest in a long line of misfortunes. The wind howled outside the weathered farmhouse as Henry sat at his kitchen table, the weak light of a single bulb illuminating the foreclosure notice that had arrived that morning. His gnarled fingers, joints swollen, from decades of hard labor traced over the bank's letterhead First National Bank of Millfield, the same institution his grandfather had helped establish nearly a century ago. Henry pushed himself up from the table, his knees protesting with a familiar ache. The kitchen was sparsely furnished, a refrigerator that hummed too loudly, a stove with only 2 working burners and cabinets with peeling paint. He opened one, revealing a single can of beans, half a loaf of stale bread, and a jar of homemade preserves Nana had put up before she passed 3 years without her, and still the sight of those strawberry preserves made his chest tighten. "One more day," Henry muttered to himself. "Just need to hold on one more day until the Social Security check comes." He moved to the window, wiping away condensation with his sleeve to peer outside. The blizzard that had been raging since morning showed no signs of abating. Snow had drifted against the barn, nearly obscuring the red paint that was fading to pink after years of neglect. Beyond that, his fields lay dormant under their white blanket, hiding the poor soil that had yielded less with each passing year. The sound of the old grandfather clock in the hallway, Nana's pride and joy, reminded Henry it was time to check in the animals. Despite everything, he still maintained a small herd of cattle, 2 horses, and a handful of chickens. The farm might be dying, but he'd be damned if he let any animal under his care suffer. Bundling up in layers of worn flannel, a heavy coat that had seen better days, and a woolen hat pulled low over his ears, Henry braced himself for the assault of the elements. The moment he opened the door, the wind nearly knocked him back, driving needles of ice against his exposed skin. Head down, he trudged through knee-deep snow toward the barn. The barn offered little relief from the cold, but at least the wind couldn't reach him here. The cattle huddled together for warmth, their breath visible in the frigid air. Old Bessie, his favorite milk cow, gave a soft moo of recognition as Henry approached. "Evening, old girl," he said, patting her flank. "Not much of a day, is it?" He worked methodically, checking water troughs to ensure they hadn't frozen, distributing the precious remaining hay, and examining each animal for signs of distress. When he finally finished his back, Agden's fingers were numb despite his gloves. As Henry turned to leave, a sound caught his attention, faint but distinct from the howling wind. He paused, listening. There it was again, a voice calling out, pushing open the barn door. Henry peered into the swirling white. The sun had set, leaving only the dim glow from his porch light to illuminate the blinding snow. He was about to dismiss the sound as a trick of the wind when he saw a small figure stumbling through the drifts at the edge of his property. "Hello," the voice called again, thin and desperate. "Is anyone there? Help." Without hesitation, Henry plunged back into the storm, fighting his way toward the voice. As he drew closer, he made out the form of a boy no more than 12 or 13, wearing only a light jacket and sneakers. The child's face was alarmingly pale, his lips tinged blue. "Boy, over here!" Henry shouted against the wind, waving an arm. The child turned toward his voice, relief washing over his features before he stumbled and fell, face first, into the snow. By the time Henry reached him, the boy was trying unsuccessfully to stand, his limbs shaking violently. Sir, the boy stammered through chattering teeth. Our cake off the road. Mick Henry didn't waste time with questions. He hoisted the boy up, surprised at how little he weighed, and half carried him toward the house. Where's your car, son? How far, don't know. Walked a long time. Mom told me to find help. She's really sick. Once inside the kitchen. Henry quickly helped the boy out of his wet clothes, wrapping him in an old quilt that still smelled faintly of Elena's lavender sachets. The boy's fingers and toes were dangerously cold, but not yet frostbitten. Henry set a pot of water to boil for tea, then reached for the ancient rotary phone on the wall. Sheriff Miller, it's Henry Coleman. Got a situation here, he explained about the boy and the stranded car with the sick mother. Roads completely impassable. Henry. Sheriff Miller replied, concern evident in his voice. Plow got stuck 2 hours ago trying to clear Main Street search. Andrescu can't get out till the storm lets up. Frank, there's a woman out there I know, Henry. I'll keep trying, but it's looking like morning at the earliest. Keep the boy warm. I'll call as soon as we can move. Henry hung up the phone and turned to find the boy staring at him with frightened eyes. My mom, the boy began. They'll find her as soon as they can, son. Henry poured hot water into a mug, adding a spoonful of sugar. What's your name, Jacob? Jacob Williams. I'm Henry Coleman. Drink this slow now. It's hot. As Jacob sipped, the tea color gradually returned to his face. His dark hair, damp from melted snow, curled against his forehead, reminding Henry painfully of his own son at that age. James would have been 43 now if he hadn't been taken by cancer at 26, Mr. Coleman. My mom has pneumonia. We were trying to get to my aunt's house in Grantham City. The storm came so fast, Jacob's voice cracked. She was coughing. Really bad? Then the car went off the road. Henry nodded, recognizing the fear in the boy's eyes. It was the same fear he'd seen in James's eyes when the doctors had delivered their prognosis. You did right, coming for help, Henry said. Your mother made a brave choice sending you out. How long were you walking? I don't know. It was still light when I started. Jacob looked down at his hands, which still trembled slightly. I got lost. Couldn't see the road anymore. It was full dark now, which meant the boy had been wandering in the blizzard for at least 3 hours. It was a miracle he'd found the farm and that he was still alive. Henry's stomach growled audibly, reminding him he hadn't eaten since morning. The boy's head snapped up at the sound, his own hunger evident in his eyes. When did you last eat, Jacob? Breakfast. Mom was too sick to stop for lunch. Henry moved to the cabinet and took out his meager supplies, the beans, the bread, the precious jar of Elena's preserves. It wasn't much, but it would have. To do, he had planned to make it last until his check arrived. But the boy needed strength more than he did as. Henry prepared the simple meal, heating the beans and toasting the bread over the still functioning burners. Jacob watched with the intensity of the truly hungry. When Henry placed the steaming plate before him, the boy looked up questioningly. Aren't you eating, Mr. Coleman? Henry waved away the concern. Already ate while you were warming. The lie came easily. It was far from the first time he'd gone hungry. Jacob hesitated only a moment before attacking the food with the abandon of youth. Henry watched him eat, a strange peace settling over him despite the circumstances. There was something right about sharing what little he had, something Eleanor would have approved of wholeheartedly. When Jacob had cleaned his plate, even using the last bit of bread to wipe up the bean sauce, Henry cleared the dishes. We should try to get some sleep, he said. Nothing more we can do tonight. You can take the spare room. Used to be my son's. You have a son? Jacob asked, following Henry up the creaking stairs. A familiar pang shot through Henry's chest. Had lost him some years back. I'm sorry, Jacob said. And Henry was struck by the genuine compassion in the boy's voice. My dad left when I was 5. Mom says he couldn't handle responsibility. Henry opened the door to James's old room. It remained largely Ash's son had left it. Model airplanes hanging from the ceiling, bookshelves filled with adventure, novels, a faded quilt with a compass pattern that Eleanor had made for his 10th birthday. He'd never had the heart to change. Anything, bathrooms down the hall if you need it. Henry said, I'm just across the way, if you need anything. Try to get some rest. Jacob sat on the edge of the bed, suddenly looking very small. Do you think? They'll find my mom tonight. Henry wanted to offer reassurance, but he wouldn't lie. About something so important. Probably not until morning sun, but your mom found shelter in the car. Right, cars are good at keeping people safe in storms. Jacob nodded, but his eyes welled with tears. She was so sick. Mr. Coleman. She could barely talk when she told me to go for help. Henry sat beside him, awkwardly patting the boy's shoulder. Your mother sounds like a strong woman, sending you for help even when she was sick. Strong people find ways to survive. Jacob wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. She's strong. She works 2 jobs so I can go to a good school. Says, I'm going to make something of myself someday. I believe she's right about that. Henry said, takes courage to walk through a blizzard like you did. That's not nothing. A ghost of a smile crossed Jacob's face. Thank you for helping me, Mr. Coleman. For the food and everything. Get some sleep. Now morning will come soon enough. As Henry settled into his own cold bed, he listened to the wind battering the old farmhouse, his stomach cramped with hunger, but the discomfort was familiar, almost a friend after the Chilean years. He'd known as he prepared the food that he was giving away his last meal with no guarantee the roads would be clear enough for him to get to town tomorrow. Yet he felt no regret. Some things were more important than comfort or even security. Eleanor had taught him that Henry's last thought before drifting into an uneasy sleep was of Jacob's mother alone in a stranded car somewhere in the blizzard. He sent up a silent prayer for her safety, knowing all too well how quickly fate could turn cruel outside. The storm raged on snowflakes, swirling like lost souls in the darkness, blanketing the world in cold silence. Inside the weathered farmhouse, 2 strangers connected by chance and compassion slept under the same roof, unaware that this night would bind their lives together in ways neither could imagine. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Henry woke to the sound of the wind's absence. After a night of relentless howling, the sudden silence was jarring. Pale winter light filtered through the frost-covered window as he pulled himself from bed joints, protesting the cold. The events of the previous night came flooding back. The boy, the stranded mother, his empty pantry moving quietly. Past James's old room where Jacob still slept, Henry made his way downstairs. The temperature in the house had dropped overnight. The ancient furnace was working but couldn't quite keep up with the bitter cold. He added wood to the living room fireplace, coaxing the embers back to life before heading to the kitchen. The empty cabinets confronted him again. No coffee, no oatmeal, not even that last can of beans. His stomach clenched with hunger, but Henry pushed the sensation aside as he had so many times before. He filled a pot with water for tea. At least he still had that. The sound of the rotary phone sliced through the quiet house. Coleman residence. Henry answered, his voice rough with sleep. Henry, it's Frank Miller, the Y. Sheriff's voice was grave. We found the car about 3 miles north of your place, just off County Road 8. Henry's grip tightened on the receiver, and the mother, a heavy pause. She didn't make it. Henry, looks like the pneumonia may be hypothermia. Dark Wilson says she was probably gone before the boy even reached your place. The news hit Henry like a physical blow. He closed his eyes, thinking of the child sleeping upstairs. God have mercy. We're bringing her to Millfield. Roads are barely passable, but we're managing. Social services has been notified. They'll send someone for the boy as soon as they can get through. I'll tell him, Henry said quietly. I'm sorry, Henry. It's a hard thing. After hanging up, Henry stood motionless in the kitchen. The weight of what he needed to do pressed down on him. He had witnessed enough grief in his life to know there was no good way to deliver such news, especially to a child. The creak of floorboards announced Jacob's presence before Henry saw him. The boy stood in the doorway, hair tousled from sleep, her blanket wrapped around his shoulders. Did they find my mom? The hope in his voice made Henry's chest ache. Henry gestured. To the kitchen table. Sit down, son. Jacob's face fell instantly, reading the answer in Henry's expression. No, he whispered, remaining frozen in the doorway. No, she's okay. She is to be okay. Jacob, Henry said, gently moving toward him. I am so sorry. The boy backed away, shaking his head. You're wrong. The sheriff made a mistake. They found her in the car. The doctor was there. Henry swallowed hard. The pneumonia was too severe. She was gone before you even reached my farm. Jacob's face crumpled, a wounded sound escaping him as his knees gave way. Henry caught him before he hit the floor, easing him into a kitchen chair. The boy's body shook with silent sobs, face buried in his hands. Henry placed a weathered hand on Jacob's shoulder, saying nothing. There were no words that could soften this blow. He simply remained present, offering the only comfort he could, that the boy was not alone in this moment. Minutes passed before Jacob looked up, his young face transformed by grief. What happens now? Sheriff says social services will come for you when the road's clear. They'll help figure things out. I don't have anybody, Jacob said, his voice hollow. Just my aunt in Grand Anthem City. But she and Mom hadn't talked in years. Dad left. There's nobody. The despair in the boy's voice struck a familiar chord in Henry. He knew that feeling. The sudden disorienting awareness that your world had collapsed, leaving you adrift. You've got a roof over your head and food in your belly today, Henry said firmly. Tomorrow will take care of itself. Jacob wiped his face with the blanket. You don't have any food. I ate the last of it. Henry almost smiled at the boy's perception. I've got connections in town. Sheriff Miller will bring supplies when he can get through. As if summoned by his name, the distant sound of an engine broke the morning stillness. Henry moved to the window, spotting the sheriff's four-wheel drive truck laboring up the snow-covered driveway. Speaking of which, he said, reaching for his coat. Sheriff Frank Miller was a barrel-chested man in his 60s with a weather-beaten face and eyes that had seen too much tragedy to be easily rattled. He stomped snow from his boots on the porch before entering, carrying 2 grocery bags. Doris Palmer heard about your visitor. Frank explained, setting the bags on the kitchen counter. She insisted, I bring these over roads, they're still a mess. But the plow got through to Main Street, figure another day before they reach out here. Henry nodded his thanks, noting Jacob's silent presence in the background. Frank's expression softened as he turned to the boy. Son, I'm Sheriff Miller. I'm mighty sorry. About your mother, Jacob said nothing, his red-rimmed eyes vacant. Frank continued gently. We've got her at the Millfield Medical Center. Once the county services worker arrives, they'll help with the arrangements. Do you have any family we should contact? My Aunt Lisa in Grand Anthem City, Jacob mumbled. But they weren't close. Frank nodded. We'll find her. For now, you're in good hands with Henry here, after the sheriff left, promising to return later with news. Henry unpacked Doris's provisions, eggs, bacon, milk, bread, canned goods, even a homemade apple pie. It was more food than he'd had in his house for months. Hungry? Henry asked, already knowing. The answer, Jacob shrugged, but his eyes followed Henry's movements as he prepared breakfast. The simple act of cooking seemed to restore some normalcy to the morning, despite the grief hanging heavy in there. They ate in silence, Jacob mechanically putting food in his mouth, without seeming to taste it. When he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet. Henry had to lean forward to hear. She was coughing up blood yesterday morning. I wanted her to go to the hospital in Grand Anthem City, but she said we couldn't afford it. Jacob stared at his plate. She thought my aunt would help. Now she's gone. Henry recognized the guilt threading through the boy's words. Your mother made her choice. Jacob, a mother protecting her child will do whatever she thinks is necessary. That's not on you. I should have made her go to the hospital. You're 12 years old. It wasn't your decision to make. Henry met Jacob's gaze steadily. Placing blame won't change what happened, and it won't honor your mother's memory. A flash of anger crossed Jacob's face. What do you know about it? More than I wish I did. Henry replied evenly. I lost my wife Eleanor 3 years ago, cancer, and before that my son, James, he was 26. The anger drained from Jacob's expression. I'm sorry, he murmured. Life deals hard blows sometimes. We either break or we endure. Jacob looked down at his half-eaten breakfast. I don't know how to do this. Nobody does at first. Henry said. You just keep breathing, keep moving one day at a time. The morning stretched into afternoon as they waited for news. Henry kept Jacob occupied with small tasks. Feeding the animals, checking the generator, clearing snow from the porch. Physical activity wouldn't heal the wound, but it might provide momentary distraction from the pain. By evening, Sheriff Miller returned with Lisa Barnes from the Millfield Gazette instead of the expected social worker. County services still can't get through, Frank explained apologetically. Maybe tomorrow. Lisa here offered to help with the news article about Nancy Williams. Lisa, a compassionate woman in her 40s, with the reporter's observant eyes, spoke gently to Jacob, asking about his mother, her job as a waitress, in Lincoln, her dreams of going back to school, her love of classic movies. Jacob answered in monosyllables at first, but gradually began sharing more, prompted by Lisa's genuine interest. She worked so hard, Jacob said, his voice steadying for the first time that day. 2 jobs, sometimes said education was the only way out of poverty. Made me promise to go to college someday. Lisa nodded, taking notes. She sounds like an extraordinary woman. She was, Jacob said simply, after Lisa left with the promise of showing Jacob the article. Before publication, Henry prepared a simple dinner from Doris's provisions. The boy ate more this time, hunger finally overcoming griefs. Suppression of appetite as they washed dishes together in companionable silence. Jacob suddenly asked, Did it get easier? After your wife and son died, Henry considered the question, giving it the honest reflection it deserved. Not easier, different. The pain changes shape, becomes something you carry rather than something that crushes you. Night fell early, as it always did in winter. Henry stoked the fire while Jacob sat wrapped in a quilt staring into the flames. The boy had cried off and on throughout the day. Brief storms of grief followed by exhausted calms. Mr. Coleman, Jacob's voice drifted from the fireplace. Can I ask you something? Of course. Why did you give me your last food last night? I saw the empty cabinets this morning. You lied about already. Eating? The direct question caught Henry off guard. He settled into his armchair before answering. It seemed like you needed it more than me, but you didn't even know me. Henry thought of Eleanor. How she would have done exactly the same thing without hesitation. My wife always said that kindness isn't something you ration based on familiarity. My mom was like that. Jacob said, his voice thick with tears. Last month, she gave our grocery money to our neighbors when their baby got sick. Sounds like she taught you well. Jacob pulled the quilt tighter around his shoulders. I'm scared, Mr. Coleman. I know, son, I know. The crackle of the fire filled the silence between them. Outside, stars emerged in the clear, cold sky. The storm had passed, but its consequences remained. Later that night, as Henry prepared to turn in, he heard muffled sobs coming from James's room. He paused outside the door, debating whether to enter. Grief was a private thing, but solitude could be its own burden. He knocked softly. Jacob, you all right? No answer came except the continued sound of crying. Henry opened the door to find Jacob curled into a tight ball on the bed, shoulders shaking. Without a word, Henry sat on the edge of the bed and placed his hand on the boy's back, offering the same silent comfort his own father had provided when Henry's mother passed decades ago. Eventually, Jacob's breathing steadied exhaustion, claiming him once more. Henry remained there for a long time, watching over the sleeping child, whose life had been shattered in a single day. In the boy's features, relaxed now in sleep, Henry saw echoes of James, the same determination in the set of the jaw, the same vulnerability around the eyes. You'll be all right, Henry whispered, though Jacob couldn't hear. Not today or tomorrow, but someday you'll be all right. As he finally rose to leave, Henry's gaze fell on the small collection of James's treasures still displayed on the dresser. A baseball signed by his high school team, a pocket watch passed down from Henry's Father. A small wooden box containing childhood mementos, objects that had once defined a life now, preserved in the amber of memory. Henry picked up the pocket watch, its silver case cool against his palm. The inscription inside the cover read, "To my, son time passes, love endures." His father had given it to him when he turned 18, and he had passed it to Jameson the same occasion. Now it sat unused. A legacy, interrupted Henry, closed his fingers around it, making a decision that felt right in a way he couldn't quite explain. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, social services, funeral arrangements, the boy's uncertain future. But tonight, in the quiet of the old farmhouse, something had shifted. A connection had formed, tenuous but real, between a grieving old man and a boy. Suddenly, alone in the world, Henry placed the watch on the nightstand where Jacob would see it in the morning, a small piece of continuity in a world suddenly devoid of constancy. It wasn't much, but sometimes the smallest gestures carried the greatest weight. 3 days after the blizzard, Nancy Williams was laid to rest in the Millfield cemetery. The service was small but dignified, attended primarily by strangers with kind faces. Doris Palmer, who had provided food, Sheriff Miller and his wife, Betty, Pastor Howard, who spoke of a woman he had never met, with surprising warmth, Lisa Barnes, whose newspaper article had captured NY's spirit so well that Jacob had wept while reading it. Henry stood beside Jacob at the grave site, a solid presence as the boy placed a single white rose on his mother's casket. The county had covered the burial expenses, and Jacob's Aunt Lisa had arrived from Grand Anthem City the previous day, a harried woman with dyed blonde hair and a perpetual frown who had not seen her sister in 8 years' time to go. Jacob, Lisa Williams said, checking her watch for the third time in as many minutes. "We've got a 3-hour drive back to Grantham, and I need to be at work by 5. Jacob looked up at Henry, his eyes pleading for something. The old farmer couldn't provide a miracle, perhaps, or simply more time. "I'll wait by the car," Lisa said with a sigh. 5 minutes. She walked away, high heels sinking into the soft earth of the cemetery. "She doesn't even like me," Jacob whispered once his aunt was out of earshot. "She and Mom fought about money all the time. She thinks I'm a burden." Henry rested his hand on Jacob's shoulder. "Give her time. Grief affects people differently. I don't want to go with her." The words burst from Jacob like they'd been bottled up for days. "She lives in a tiny apartment. She said I'd have to sleep on the couch until she figures something out, and she already talked about boarding schools." Henry had anticipated this moment but still found himself unprepared. The past few days had created a fragile routine between them. Caring for the animals, sharing meals, sitting by the fire in the evenings while Jacob slowly began to talk about his mother, his school, his dreams of becoming an engineer someday. In the boy's presence, the old farmhouse had felt alive again. The silence that had grown so oppressive since Elena's passing temporarily held at bay. "Karen Foster from Social Services explained your options," Henry said gently. "Your aunt is your closest living relative. Unless there are serious concerns about her ability to care for you, she doesn't want to care for me." Jacob interrupted. "She said so herself, when she thought I couldn't hear. Said she never asked for this responsibility." The county social worker had been clear about the situation, with no other relatives coming forward. Jacob would go to his aunt. If that placement failed, he would enter the foster system at 12. His chances of permanent adoption were slim. He would likely bounce between temporary homes until he aged out of the system. At 18, Mr. Coleman, Jacob said, his voice dropping to a whisper, "Can't I stay with you?" The question hung in the cold air between them. Henry had asked himself the same thing repeatedly over the past sleepless nights. He was 67 years old, living on Social Security, and what little the failing farm still produced. The bank was preparing to foreclose. What could he possibly offer a child? "Jacob, I know you're having money problems." Jacob pressed on. "I could help with the farm. I'm stronger than I look. And when school starts, I could get a paper route or something." Henry knelt with difficulty, his arthritic knees protesting until he was eye level with the boy. "It's not about that. I'm an old man with an uncertain future. You deserve stability. You gave me your last meal," Jacob said, his eyes filling with tears. Nobody's ever done anything like that for me except Mom. I feel safe with you. Henry felt his resolve weakening. The truth was the thought of the boy leaving created a hollow feeling in his chest. In just a few days, Jacob had awakened something in the old farmhouse and in Henry himself that he had thought was gone forever. Jacob Lisa's impatient call cut through the moment. "We need to go now." Henry straightened, wincing at the pain in his knees. "You'd better go, son." Jacob's face fell, but he nodded, resignation replacing hope. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the silver pocket watch Henry had left by his bedside that first night. "You should take this back," he said, holding it out. Henry shook his head, closing Jacob's fingers back around the watch. "It's yours. Now to remember that there are people who care about you, even when times are hard." Jacob's chin trembled as he tucked the watch back into his pocket. Without warning, he threw his arms around Henry's waist, hugging him fiercely. "Thank you for everything, Mr. Coleman." Henry embraced the boy briefly, then gently set him back. "Go on now, your aunt's waiting." He watched as Jacob walked away, shoulders hunched against more than just the cold. The boy paused at his mother's grave for one final goodbye, before continuing toward the cemetery gates where his aunt stood impatiently by her car. "You're doing the right thing," Henry Sheriff Miller said, appearing at his side. "Boy needs family." "Does he?" Henry murmured, watching Lisa usher Jacob into her sedan with minimal gentleness. "Or does he just need someone who cares?" Frank clasped his shoulder sympathetically. "Need a ride back to the farm?" Henry shook his head. "Think I'll walk clear." "My head." The 2-mile journey from the cemetery to Willow Ridge Farm gave Henry time to think, his boots crunching through snow that had begun to melt under the strengthening February sun. All around him, the Nebraska landscape stretched vast and unforgiving, fields of white, broken by the occasional farmhouse or barn, many as weathered and struggling as his own. By the time he reached his property, Henry had made a decision. It might be foolish, probably futile, but he couldn't live with himself if he didn't try. Inside the empty house, he went straight to the telephone and dialed Karen Foster's office number. The social worker sounded tired when she answered, the weight of too many cases evident in her voice. "Miss Foster, it's Henry Coleman, about Jacob Williams. Mr. Coleman, we've been through this. His aunt is his legal guardian now. There's nothing I want to apply to be his foster parent." Henry interrupted with the possibility of adoption. Silence met his declaration. Then carefully, "Mr. Coleman, while I appreciate your concern for Jacob, there are many factors to consider: your age, your financial situation. I raised a son. I have a 3-bedroom house. I can provide a stable environment." Henry gripped the phone tighter. "All I'm asking is that you consider it. Come out to the farm. Do an assessment. Let me try." More silence, followed by the sound of papers shuffling. "It's unorthodox. You have no prior relationship with the boy. We have a connection." Henry insisted. "You should have seen him here. He helped with the animals." He started talking about his mother processing his grief. His aunt doesn't want him, she made that clear to everyone, but Karen sighed audibly. "I'll need to discuss this with my supervisor. And even if, and this is a big, if we considered you as a placement option, Jacob's aunt would have to voluntarily relinquish guardianship. Just talk to her," Henry urged. She might be relieved to have another option. After hanging up, Henry moved through the quiet house, acutely aware of Jacob's absence. The boy's borrowed clothes still hung over the shower rod in the bathroom. His schoolbook, the only possession he'd had with him when he arrived, still sat on the kitchen table. Henry picked up the book, a dog-eared copy of The Old Man and the Sea, and found himself smiling at the parallel. An old man alone fighting against forces larger than himself. The difference was Hemingway's protagonist had found brief companionship with a boy before returning to his solitude. Henry had experienced the reverse. The next morning brought Victor Reynolds from the bank to Henry's door, his luxury sedan looking out of place in the rooted driveway. "Henry," Victor said, removing immaculately polished shoes before entering the house. "I wanted to check on you after the storm and discuss our situation. Our situation as if they shared ownership of the problem." Henry gestured the banker toward the kitchen table, the only place in the house suitable for a meeting. Victor placed a folder on the table, his manicured hands a stark contrast to Henry's work-worn ones. "As you know, the bank has been patient, but we're approaching the limit of what our board will allow. The foreclosure notice you received is final." When Henry asked flatly, 30 days, Victor at least had the decency to look uncomfortable. "I've brought the paperwork outlining your options." Henry barely heard as Victor detailed those options, all of which essentially amounted to the same thing: losing the farm that had been in his family for generations. "There is a potential buyer interested in the property," Victor continued. "Lawrence Brooks from Midwest Development. They're acquiring several parcels in the area for a planned commercial development. His offer would at least clear your outstanding debt, possibly leave you with a small sum commercial development." Henry repeated, "They want to build a strip mall on farmland." Victor adjusted his tie. "The proposal involves a mixed-use development with retail, residential, and some light industrial components. It would bring jobs to Millfield and destroy productive farmland in the process." "Henry, with all due respect, your land hasn't been productive for years. The soil quality has degraded, your equipment is outdated, and you're operating at a loss." Victor softened his tone. "This could be a blessing in disguise. Take the money, get a small place in town. Enjoy your retirement." The suggestion was so fundamentally disconnected from who Henry was that he almost laughed. Retire? To what? The farm wasn't just his livelihood, it was his identity, his purpose, his connection to the past and future. "I'll review your paperwork," Henry said, making no move to touch the folder. Victor nodded, recognizing the dismissal at the door. He paused. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry it's come to this. My father spoke highly of yours different times back then." After Victor left, Henry sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the banker's folder without opening it. The farm had weathered the Dust Bowl economic depressions and personal tragedies. The thought of it being bulldozed for some developer's profit felt like a desecration. The ringing phone broke his reverie. "Henry, it's Karen Foster. I've spoken with my supervisor about Jacob." Henry straightened, hope flaring, and "It's complicated. On one hand, Lisa Williams has indeed expressed reservations about taking Jacob permanently. On the other hand, our concerns about your situation remain. What would I need to do?" Henry asked, determination hardening his voice. "We would need to conduct a home study. You'd need to complete foster parent training. There would be background checks, financial disclosures, health evaluations." Karen paused. "And you would need to demonstrate a stable living situation. If you're facing foreclosure, as rumored, the last requirement landed like a blow." Henry glanced at the banker's folder. The reality of his situation, inescapable. "I see. I'm sorry, Henry. For what it's worth, I believe you care deeply for Jacob, but the system has requirements I can't circumvent." After hanging up, Henry moved to the window, looking out over the land his grandfather had purchased in 1887. The original homestead had been small, just 80 acres, but subsequent generations had expanded it to the current 240. Not massive by modern farming standards, but substantial enough to support a family through most of the 20th century. Henry could trace his earliest memories to this land, helping his father mend fences at age 5, learning to drive the tractor at 10, bringing Alelena home as a bride at 22. James had been born in the upstairs bedroom during a thunderstorm so fierce the doctor couldn't make it out from town. Now it would all be lost, not just to Henry, but to whatever future might have been possible. The sound of tires on the gravel driveway drew his attention. A silver sedan he didn't recognize pulled up, and Karen Foster emerged, followed by a reluctant-looking Lisa Williams, and to Henry's surprise, Jacob. Henry met them on the porch, confusion giving way to cautious hope as he noted the suitcase in Jacob's hand. "Mr. Coleman," Karen began. "Formally, Ms. Williams has requested we discuss a potential alternative arrangement for Jacob's placement." Lisa crossed her arms, avoiding eye contact. I'm not cut out for this, she said bluntly. I work 60 hours a week, I have a one-bedroom apartment and a boyfriend who isn't interested in playing stepdad. Jacob deserves better. We wanted to visit in person. Karen explained to discuss whether temporary placement with you might be feasible while we identify a permanent solution. Jacob's expression was a mixture of hope and fear. His knuckles white around the suitcase handle. I thought your regulations, Henry began, are still in effect. Karen finished. But given the circumstances, we're exploring all options. May we come in the next hour was spent in careful conversation. Lisa admitting she had taken Jacob only out of obligation. Jacob quietly but firmly stating his preference to stay with Henry. Karen outlining the numerous hurdles still to be overcome. The foreclosure is the most immediate concern, Karen said finally. Without stable housing, foster placement would be impossible. Henry hesitated, then opened Victor's folder. The bank has given me 30 days. If I could find a way to save the farm. Karen's expression was sympathetic but realistic. That's a significant if Mr. Coleman and I have savings, Lisa interjected unexpectedly. Not much, but enough for a security deposit and first month's rent on a 2-bedroom apartment. Jacob could have his own room. I could adjust my schedule. The offer surprised everyone, especially Jacob, whose face fell at this sudden reversal from his aunt. That's very generous, Karen said carefully. It's not what I want. Jacob said, his voice small but steady. Lisa sighed, running a hand through her blonde hair. I'm trying, Jacob, I really am. An uncomfortable silence settled over the kitchen until Henry spoke. What if we had a trial and period? Jacob stays here while I work on the foreclosure situation. If I can't resolve it within 30 days, he goes with Miss Williams to her new apartment. Karen considered this, tapping her pen against her notepad. Technically, as a kinship placement, Miss Williams has priority. But if she's willing to authorize a temporary arrangement, Lisa nodded, relief evident in her posture. 30 days if Mr. Coleman can get his situation sorted, and if Jacob wants to stay, I won't stand in the way. Jacob's expression brightened instantly. Really, I still need to conduct a proper home assessment, Karen cautioned, and you'll need to begin foster parent classes immediately, Mr. Coleman. Henry nodded, scarcely believing the turn of events. I understand. As Karen led Lisa outside to complete some paperwork in her car, Henry and Jacob were left alone in the kitchen. The boy stood awkwardly as if unsure of his place now. Did you mean it? Jacob asked. You really want me to stay? Henry felt a smile. The first genuine one in days cross his face. I do, but you heard Miss Foster, I need to find a way to save the farm first. Jacob set down his suitcase and squared his shoulders with newfound determination. Then we'll save it together. Looking at the boy's resolute expression, Henry felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope the odds were heavily stacked. Against them, a financially ruined old farmer and an orphaned 12-year-old boy against banks, developers, and bureaucracy. Yet in that moment, with Jacob standing in his kitchen once more, Henry couldn't help but believe that, maybe, just maybe, they had a fighting chance. Together he agreed, extending his hand. To shake on it, Manto Man. Jacob took his hand solemnly, the silver chain of the pocket watch visible at his wrist. I promise I won't let you down, Mr. Coleman, Henry the old farmer corrected gently. I think it's time you called me Henry. The first week of their arrangement passed in a flurry of activity. Karen Foster's home assessment had gone reasonably well. The farmhouse was old but clean and structurally sound. Henry had begun the required foster parent classes in Grantham City twice a week. Making the hour-long drive in his aging pickup truck, Jacob had been enrolled in Millfield Middle School, where he quickly demonstrated an aptitude for mathematics and science that impressed his teachers. But the looming foreclosure remained an insurmountable obstacle. Henry had visited 3 banks in neighboring counties, each turning down his loan application with varying degrees of sympathy. His credit was poor, his income insufficient, and the farm's productivity had declined too significantly to secure additional financing. We've got to think outside the box, Jacob declared one evening as they sat at the kitchen table reviewing Henry's financial documents. The boy had shown a surprising understanding of budgets and business matters. a result, he explained, of helping his mother manage their limited resources. "For years I've been farming this land for 50 years, Henry replied, rubbing his tired eyes. "I'm not sure there's an angle I haven't considered." Jacob tapped his pencil against the table thoughtfully. "What about selling part of the land instead of all of it? Could you keep the house and maybe 40 acres? I approached Victor about that last year. The bank wasn't interested in a partial solution. Besides, what would I do with just 40 acres? It's not enough to make a living, but it's enough to live on." Jacob persisted. "You could grow specialty crops instead of commodity corn and soybeans. My science teacher, Mr. Benson, was talking about how organic farming and direct-to-consumer sales are changing agriculture." Henry managed a small smile. After just a week in school, Jacob was already bringing home new ideas. "Organics, huh? It takes years to get certified and the transition period is costly. What about your neighbors? Couldn't any of them help?" Henry shook his head. "Most are in the same boat or worse. Doris Palmer is doing okay with her sheep operation, but she's not in a position to bail me out. Besides," he added with a touch of pride, "Colemans don't take handouts. It's not a handout if you pay it back." Jacob countered, "That's just business," as they continued brainstorming increasingly unlikely scenarios. The phone rang. Henry answered to find Lisa Barnes from the newspaper on the line. "Henry, I was hoping to speak with Jacob. I've had an interesting development regarding the article about his mother." "Hold on," Henry said, passing the receiver to Jacob. Jacob listened intently, his expression shifting from curiosity to surprise. "Really that many?" "Yes, ma'am, I'll ask him." He covered the mouthpiece and turned to Henry. "Ms. Barnes says people have been calling and writing to the newspaper about Mom's story. Someone to donate money to help with my expenses. She wants to know if it's okay to set up a memorial fund." Henry considered this. His first instinct was to refuse that same pride that had kept him from seeking help even as his situation deteriorated. But this wasn't about him. "It's your decision, Jacob. Your mother's memory." Jacob nodded and returned to the call. "Yes, that would be nice. Thank you, Ms. Barnes." After hanging up, he explained, "She said it probably won't be much, but it might help with school supplies and clothes. Mom would have liked that people cared enough to help." Henry squeezed the boy's shoulder, impressed by his maturity. Your mother raised a thoughtful young man. The following morning brought another visitor to Willow Ridge Farm. Lawrence Brooks himself, CEO of Midwest Development, arrived in a black SUV that dwarfed Henry's pickup. The developer was younger than Henry had expected, perhaps with the polished appearance of someone accustomed to closing deals. Mr. Coleman Brooks greeted him on the porch, extending a manicured hand. "I've been hoping to meet you. I understand Victor Reynolds has discussed our interest in your property." Henry shook the man's hand briefly. "He mentioned it. May I come in? I believe I can offer you a better deal than what the bank proposed." Inside, Brookie surveyed the modest kitchen with the calculating eye of someone mentally redecorating. Jacob, who had been doing homework at the table, watched the newcomer wearily. "Victor likely told you we're acquiring several properties in the area." Brooks began opening a leather portfolio. "What he may not have mentioned is that your land is particularly valuable to us due to its location near the highway interchange. We're prepared to offer you 20% above market value." Henry raised an eyebrow. "Generous. We believe in fair compensation. This offer would not only clear your debt but provide a substantial nest egg for your retirement." Brookie slid a document across the table. "And we're prepared to include relocation assistance to help you find suitable housing in town." Henry glanced at the figure on the paper. More money than he had seen in years, though still far less than what the land would have been worth in its prime. "And what exactly are you planning to build here?" Brooks smiled, warming to his subject. "Millfield Commons, a mixed-use development with retail, dining, entertainment, and residential components. The first phase includes a grocery superstore, a home improvement warehouse, and several national restaurant chains. Later phases will add an apartment complex and possibly a hotel on farmland," Henry said flatly. "On underutilized land," Brooks corrected smoothly. "Mr. Coleman, I respect your attachment to this property, but the economic reality is that small farms like yours are no longer viable. Our development will create over 300 jobs, and I significantly expand Millfield's tax base and pave over soil that's been growing food for over a century. Brooks sighed as if dealing with a stubborn child. Progress requires change. Mr. Coleman, the agricultural economy that built this town is fading. Without new development, Millfield will continue to decline until it's just another ghost town on the prairie. Jacob, who had been silent until now, spoke up. What about the Coleman family cemetery on the north section? There are 5 generations buried there. Brooks looked surprised, clearly, not having expected opposition from a child. We would of course handle any relocation of remains with appropriate respect, and according to state regulations. Relocation. Henry's voice hardened. My parents, grandparents, and son are buried there. My wife Eleanor too. I understand your emotional attachment. No, Mr. Brooks. I don't think you do. Henry stood, indicating the meeting was over. I appreciate your offer, but I'm not interested in selling to you. Brooks remained seated, his pleasant demeanor turning clinical. Mr. Coleman, with all due respect, you may not have a choice. Once the bank forecloses, we'll simply purchase the property from them. I came to you directly as a courtesy. Then I appreciate the courtesy, but my answer stands. After Brooks left, Jacob looked at Henry with wide eyes. He wants to dig up your family's graves. Can he really do that? Henry sank back into his chair, suddenly exhausted. If he owns the landies, there are regulations, but essentially yes, then we definitely can't let him have it. Jacob's voice was fierce with conviction. Henry wished he shared the boy's certainty. The truth was, Brooks was right. Barring a miracle, the choice was no longer Henry's to make. Once the bank took possession, they would sell to the highest bidder, and Midwest Development clearly had deep pockets. That evening, as Jacob did his homework, Henry made a difficult phone call to his old friend Judge Walter Simpson. The retired judge had helped draft Henry's will years ago and was one of the few people in Millfield who might understand the legal complexities of their situation. Cemetery relocation is complicated but not impossible, Walter explained after hearing Henry's predicament. Brooks would need permits and you could potentially challenge them, but that would require legal resources. I suspect you don't have. What about historical designation? The oldest graves date back to 1887, worth exploring, but it takes time. None of them more than the 30 days you have before foreclosure. Henry's shoulders sagged. I'm running out of options. Walter, have you considered selling development rights to only part of the property, conservation easements for the cemetery and surrounding area? Brooks made it clear he wants the entire parcel, and honestly, breaking up the farm feels like admitting defeat anyway. Walter was silent for a moment. Henry, I've known you most of my life. You're one of the most stubborn men I've ever met. And that's saying something coming from a judge, but sometimes the wisest course is to accept what can't be changed and focus on what can. After hanging up, Henry stepped onto the back porch. The February evening was cold but clear, stars pricking the vast Nebraska sky. In the distance, the silhouettes of his outbuilding stood dark against the horizon. The barn his grandfather had built, the equipment shed where his father had taught him to change a tractor's oil. The old silo that hadn't held grain in 20 years. Inside each structure were the accumulated tools and treasures of generations. His great-grandfather's hand-forged plow, his mother's canning equipment, James's first bicycle. Objects imbued with memories that made this place more than just land. It was the physical manifestation of his family's story. The screen door creaked as Jacob joined him on the porch. It's really beautiful out here at night, the boy said, zipping his jacket against the cold. You can see so many more stars than in Lincoln light pollution. Henry nodded. Cities glow so bright they drown out the stars. They stood in companionable silence, breath forming small clouds in the cold air. Henry, Jacob finally asked, "Do you believe in miracles?" The question caught Henry off guard. His relationship with faith had grown complicated after losing James and Eleanor in such quick succession. I believe unexpected things happen sometimes. Why do you ask? Mom always said that when things seemed hopeless, that's when you had to believe the hardest. Jacob twisted the chain of the pocket watch around his wrist. She said giving up hope was like closing a door before someone had a chance to knock. Henry considered this. Your mother sounds like she was a wise woman. She was. Jacob's voice wavered but steadied. She also said that sometimes help comes from where you least expect it. The next day brought unexpected visitors to Willow Ridge Farm. A sleek black town car with New York plates pulled into the driveway, just as Henry and Jacob were finishing breakfast. "You expecting anyone?" Henry asked, peering out the window. Jacob shook his head, equally puzzled. They watched as the driver opened the rear door and an elderly woman emerged, followed by a distinguished-looking man in an expensive overcoat. Both were strangers to Henry. "Maybe they're lost," Jacob suggested as Henry went to answer the knock at the door. The elderly woman smiled warmly when Henry opened the door. "Mr. Coleman, my name is Ruth Simpson, I believe. You know my husband, Walter." Henry blinked in surprise. "You're the judge's wife. I didn't realize you were visiting." "Walter didn't mention he doesn't know." "I'm here," Ruth interrupted with a conspiratorial smile. "May we come in? This is my nephew, Michael Grant. He's an agricultural loan specialist from Chicago." Henry led them to the kitchen where Jacob had hastily cleared away the breakfast dishes. After introductions, Ruth came straight to the point. "Walter told me about your situation last night. He didn't think there was a solution, but I believe otherwise." Her eyes twinkled with determination. "Michael here specializes in finding creative financing solutions for family farms in distress." Michael Grant spread several documents on the table. "Mrs. Simpson explained your circumstances. Mr. Coleman, I've been reviewing county records this morning to get a clearer picture of your property's potential." Henry was skeptical, but listened as Michael outlined possibilities: restructuring the debt, exploring agricultural incentive programs, and most surprisingly, the concept of an agurism operation that could generate additional revenue. "Your farm's history and setting have significant appeal," Michael explained, "with targeted investments in infrastructure. You could develop educational programs, seasonal events, even farmstay accommodations that would supplement traditional agricultural income. People would pay to stay on a working farm." Henry asked. "Doubtfully, urban families increasingly seek authentic, rural experiences." Michael nodded. "They want their children to understand where food comes from, to connect with a simpler way of life." Jacob, who had been listening intently, jumped in. "Like when Doris Palmer lets school groups visit her sheep farm in the spring. She said it's her most profitable week of the year." "Exactly," Michael smiled at the boy. "Multiply that concept across 4 seasons with various offerings, and you create a diversified income stream that's less vulnerable to agricultural market fluctuations." Henry shook his head. "This all sounds good in theory, but it doesn't solve my immediate problem. The bank wants their money in 3 weeks. Ruth Simpson's smile deepened. "That's where I come in, Mr. Coleman. Walter doesn't know this, but I have a personal inheritance from my family. I've been looking for a meaningful investment opportunity, and I believe your farm has potential." Henry stared at her in disbelief. "Mrs. Simpson, I can't ask you to." "You didn't ask. I'm offering." Ruth's expression grew serious. "Walter has spoken of you with respect for decades. He tells me you're a man of integrity who has faced more than his share of hardship with dignity. The bank may not value those qualities, but I do." "It wouldn't be charity," Michael added quickly, sensing Henry's hesitation. "Mrs. Simpson would be a silent partner with a formal investment structure and repayment terms. The arrangement would be properly documented and legally binding." "Why would you do this for someone you've just met?" Henry asked Ruth. The elderly woman's eyes softened. "Because 45 years ago, when I was a young widow with 2 small children, a farmer helped me when my car broke down during a blizzard. He not only fixed my car, but insisted on giving us his lunch when he heard my children were hungry." She glanced at Jacob. "Some debts can never be repaid directly, so we pass them forward." The parallel to Henry's own act of kindness toward Jacob was unmistakable. Henry found himself speechless, fighting a sudden tightness in his throat. Jacob looked between the adults, hope dawning on his face. "Does this mean we might be able to save the farm?" Michael tempered expectations. "It's not a guarantee. We'd need to move quickly, and there would be significant work ahead to make the new business model successful. But yes, it's a possibility." As Ruth and Michael prepared to leave after 2 hours of preliminary planning, Ruth took Henry's weathered hands in her soft ones. "Walter always says that justice isn't just about the law, it's about balance. You've given much to others, Mr. Coleman. Perhaps it's time to allow others to give to you." After they departed, Henry and Jacob stood on the porch watching the black car disappear down the long driveway. "Do you think it will work?" Jacob asked, his voice hushed as if speaking too loudly might break the spell of possibility. Henry placed his hand on the boy's shoulder. "I don't know, but for the first time in a long while I'm willing to hope it might." The next 2 weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity at Willow Ridge Farm. Michael Grant had moved with surprising efficiency, assembling the necessary paperwork for Ruth Simpson's investment and negotiating with First National Bank Victor Reynolds. Had been resistant at first, having already promised the land to Lawrence Brooks, but the legally binding offer presented by Michael's firm had left him little choice but to proceed with the refinancing. Henry still could hardly believe the turn of events. Ruth Simpson's investment would clear his outstanding debt and provide operating capital for the farm's transformation into what Michael called a heritage agriculture experience. The concept combined traditional farming practices with educational opportunities for visitors, something Henry had initially viewed with skepticism but was gradually warming to. Meanwhile, Jacob had thrown himself wholeheartedly into research, spending hours at the Millfield library after school printing articles about agriorism operations across the Midwest. His enthusiasm was infectious, gradually chipping away at Henry's ingrained resistance to change. "Look at this place in Iowa," Jacob said one evening, spreading printouts across the kitchen table. "They started with just corn mazie in the fall, and now they have a farm-to-table restaurant and overnight cabins. They make more money from visitors than from their crops." Henry studied the pictures, noting the carefully maintained historic barn, the smiling families, the rows of heritage vegetables. "Seems like they're selling nostalgia as much as food." "Is that so bad?" Jacob asked. "People want to connect with where their food comes from. You have stories about this land that go back over 100 years. That's valuable." Before Henry could respond, a knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Sheriff Frank Miller stood on the porch, his expression grave. "Evening." Henry got a minute in the living room. Frank declined Henry's offer of coffee, getting straight to the point. "Brooks is making noise at the town council. Says your refinancing plan is a roadblock to progress and that his development would create more jobs and tax revenue than your farm ever could." Henry frowned. "The bank accepted our offer. It's a done deal." "The bank, yes, but Brooks is lobbying the council about zoning changes that could affect your ability to operate the kind of business you're planning. He's got Mayor Phillips practically in his pocket." "Can they really block us after we've secured the financing?" Jacob asked from the doorway, having quietly joined the conversation. Frank addressed the boy directly, respecting his involvement. "Zoning laws determine what kinds of business activities are permitted in different areas. Currently, your property is zoned for agricultural use only. To operate the tourism aspects, Michael Grant has proposed you'd need a variance or rezoning approval from the council." Henry's shoulders slumped slightly. "So Brooks just moves the battlefield from the bank to the town council." "Exactly. And he's got deep pockets for making campaign contributions and promises about future tax revenue." Frank leaned forward. "The council's holding a public hearing next Tuesday evening. You might want to be there." After Frank left, Henry paced the living room, frustration evident in every step. "Just when I thought we had a clear path forward," Jacob sat on the arm of the sofa, his young face thoughtful. "We need to convince the council that our plan is better for Millfield than Brooks' development. Brooks can promise hundreds of jobs and millions in tax revenue. We can't compete with that. But those are just numbers." Jacob argued. "What about the people? The actual town do they want? To become another place with the same big box stores and fast food chains as everywhere else?" Henry paused, struck by the boy's insight. "You might have a point there." The following day, Henry visited Doris Palmer's sheep farm to share the latest developments. The elderly woman listened intently. As they sat at her kitchen table, her shrewd eyes narrowing at the mention of Brooks' maneuvers. "That man," she muttered, pouring more coffee into Henry's cup, "showed up here last month with his fancy suit and city manners, offering to buy my land too. Told him I wasn't interested. Next thing I know, I'm getting calls from the county assessor about my property taxes being reviewed. He's playing hardball. Henry agreed, and he's got the mayor in his corner. Doris tapped her fingers against the worn tabletop. Phillips is up for re-election next year. He needs Brooks' project to show he's revitalizing the economy or some such nonsense. How do we fight that with people? Doris said firmly. Brooks has money, but he doesn't have roots here. You do. Your family has been part of this community for generations. That counts for something. Does it? Times have changed. Doris. Some things haven't. She reached for her phone. I know at least 20 families who'd rather see Willow Ridge Farm succeed than watch another cookie-cutter development go up. Let me make some calls by the weekend. Word had spread throughout Millfield about the upcoming council hearing. Lisa Barnes published a feature in the Gazette, highlighting the historical significance of Willow Ridge Farm and the innovative vision for its future. The article included a sidebar comparing the farm's heritage tourism proposal with Midwest Development's commercial plan, subtly emphasizing the contrast between local ownership and outside corporate interests. Jacob, meanwhile, had recruited his science teacher, Mr. Benson, to help prepare a presentation about the environmental benefits of preserving agricultural land versus converting it to commercial use. The teacher, an enthusiastic environmentalist, eagerly provided data on water runoff, soil preservation, and habitat conservation. We need to make this about more than just one farm, Mr. Benson advised as they worked on slides in the school computer lab. It's about the character and future of Millfield itself. On Sunday afternoon, Henry and Jacob visited the Coleman family cemetery on the north edge of the property. They cleared away winter debris from the gravestones, working in companionable silence among the generations of Colemans resting beneath the sheltering branches of ancient oak trees. Henry paused before Elena's grave, his fingers tracing the engraved letters. Of her name, she would have liked you, he told Jacob quietly. She had a soft spot for determined spirits. Jacob knelt beside the neighboring stone marking James Coleman's final resting place. Do you think he would have minded me staying in his room? No, Henry said with certainty. James was generous, always bringing home strays, dogs, cats, even nursed a hawk with a broken wing once he smiled at the memory. He would have understood. Jacob carefully placed a small stone on top of James's marker, a gesture of respect he'd seen in a movie once. Sometimes I talk to him, the boy admitted. At night when I can't sleep, I tell him I'll look after you. Henry felt his throat tighten with emotion. You do that, do you? Jacob nodded. Serious, I think he'd want someone to. And since I'm here. Henry placed his hand on the boy's, shoulder words failing him. In just weeks, this child had worked his way into Henry's life in ways he couldn't have anticipated, filling empty spaces he'd thought would remain vacant forever. We're going to fight for this place, Henry said, finally gazing across the cemetery to the fields beyond. Not just for me or for them, he gestured to the gravestones, but for you too. For your future. Tuesday evening arrived with the town hall packed beyond capacity. It seemed half of Millfield had turned out for the zoning hearing, forcing the council to move the meeting to the high school gymnasium. Henry was astonished to see so many familiar faces, not just close friends like Doris Palmer and Frank Miller, but people he knew only in passing, farmers from neighboring properties, shopkeepers from town, even Victor Reynolds from the bank looking distinctly uncomfortable. Lawrence Brooks sat near the front with Mayor Phillips. Both men in expensive suits that stood out among the predominantly casual attire of the town's people. Brooks appeared confident, reviewing notes on Atablet, while occasionally scanning the crowd with slight disdain. Mayor Phillips called the meeting to order, explaining the purpose of the hearing to consider zoning variances that would affect both the proposed Midwest Development Project and Willow Ridge Farm's heritage tourism plans. Brooks presented, first unveiling architectural renderings of Millfield Commons on large display boards. The sleek modern buildings and expansive parking lots bore no resemblance to the current character of Millfield, but Brooks emphasized job creation, tax revenue, and bringing Millfield into the 21st century. Change is inevitable, Brooks concluded smoothly. The question is whether Millfield will embrace progressor, cling to an agricultural past that can no longer sustain its economy. Our development offers a clear path to prosperity. When Henry's turn came, he approached the microphone with Jacob at his side. Public speaking had never been his strength, but as he faced his neighbors, he found himself drawing courage from the boy beside him. My grandfather bought our land in 1887. Henry began, his voice steadying as he spoke. He didn't have fancy drawings or economic projections. He just had faith in the soil and the conviction that hard work would yield something of value. Henry explained the vision for Willow Ridge Farm's future, not as a museum frozen in time, but as a living bridge between agricultural heritage and modern sustainable practices. He described educational programs for schools, seasonal events, celebrating rural traditions and partnerships with local artisans and food producers. Mr. Brooks speaks of progress as if it can only be measured in square footage of retail space, Henry said. But true, progress builds on foundations already laid. It doesn't bulldoze them to start from scratch. Jacob then presented the environmental data Mr. Benson had helped compile, speaking with surprising poise for a 12-year-old. He explained how the farm's plans would preserve green space, protect water quality, and maintain wildlife corridors that would be lost under Brooks' development. I haven't lived in Millfield very long, Jacob concluded. But even I can see that this town is special because it's not like everywhere else. Once you pave farmland, you can't get it back. Is that the legacy you want to leave for future generations? The gymnasium erupted in applause, surprising both Henry and Jacob. As they returned to their seats, Doris Palmer took the microphone, next followed by a stream of residents speaking in favor of preserving Willow Ridge Farm and granting the zoning variances it needed. An elderly woman, Henry barely recognized, recounted how his father had delivered food to her family during the 1960s. Drought when her own husband was hospitalized. A middle-aged man recalled school trips to the farm where Henry's wife, Elena, a former teacher, had shown city children how to milk cows and gather eggs. Even Betty Miller, the sheriff's wife who ran the local diner, testified about how tourism around authentic farm experiences could benefit downtown businesses. Brooks watched with growing alarm as the tide of public opinion visibly turned against his project. When he attempted to rebut with additional economic projections, the audience grew restless, someone calling out, "Money isn't everything, Mr. Brooks." Mayor Phillips, sensing the mood of his constituents, began to distance himself subtly from the developer, his comments becoming more measured and non-committal. The council adjourned without making an immediate decision, but Chairman Roberts promised a vote within the week. As people filed out of the gymnasium, many stopped to shake Henry's hand or pat Jacob's shoulder. The boy beamed with pride at being treated as an equal partner in the farm's future. Quitea showing Sheriff Miller commented as he and his wife joined Henry and Jacob outside. Never seen the town rally like that for anything but the state football championships. It wasn't just for us, Henry said, still processing the unexpected support. Brooks threatened something everyone values even if they don't think about it much. The character of this place. Betty Miller smiled warmly at Jacob. This young man made quite an impression too. Spoke better than most adults I know. Jacob ducked his head, embarrassed by the praise I just said, what I thought was important. As they walked toward Henry's truck, Lawrence Brooks intercepted them, his polished facade showing cracks of frustration. That was quite a performance, Coleman, he said coldly, tugging at heartstrings with nostalgia and bringing a child to do your emotional heavy lifting. Henry stiffened, but Jacob spoke before he could respond. It wasn't a performance, Mr. Brooks. It was the truth, and I wanted to speak. Brooks narrowed his eyes at the boy. You've been in town, 3 weeks, yet you presume to lecture lifelong residents about what's best for their community. Sometimes it takes fresh eyes to see what's valuable, Jacob replied steadily. My mom taught me that. Brooks scoffed, turning back to Henry. This isn't over. The council hasn't voted yet, and sentiment doesn't pay the bills. When people realize the tax benefits they're giving up, they might reconsider their charming attachment to your failing farm. Maybe, Henry acknowledged, but I think you underestimate what people truly value, Mr. Brooks. Not everything worthwhile can be measured in dollars. As Brooks stalked away, Jacob leaned against Henry's side, suddenly looking tired after the emotional evening. Did we do enough? he asked quietly. Henry draped his arm around the boy's shoulders. I believe we did, son. Whatever happens next, we stood up for something that matters. That's never wasted effort. The following morning, Henry woke early as usual, heading out to tend the animals before Jacob needed to leave for school. The crisp March air carried hints of the spring to come frost-giving, way mood as the Nebraska winter reluctantly released its grip. As he returned from the barn, Henry spotted an unfamiliar vehicle parked beside his truck, a state government car with official markings. His heart sank immediately, assuming it was related. To Jacob's fostering situation, had Karen Foster come to deliver bad news instead, he found Susan Roberts, the regional agricultural representative, waiting on his porch with a thick folder under her arm. Mr. Coleman, she greeted him as he approached. Was at the council meeting last night but didn't get a chance to speak with you. I wonder if we might talk about some programs that could benefit your heritage farm project. Inside the kitchen where Jacob was eating breakfast before school, Susan spread out various documents detailing state and federal initiatives supporting agricultural preservation, rural tourism, development, and historical conservation. Your situation has caught the attention of several departments, she explained. The combination of historical significance, innovative land use, and educational components makes Willow Ridge Farm potentially eligible for multiple support programs. Henry reviewed the materials with cautious optimism. This would certainly help with implementation costs. If the council approves our zoning requests about that, Susan said, her expression brightening. I received a call from Councilman Peters this morning. The vote has been moved up. They're convening a special session this afternoon. Jacob looked up from his cereal. Is that good or bad? Peters thinks it's good. Susan replied, he said, and I quote, Brooks is applying pressure behind the scenes, so we're going to vote before he can fly in more consultants from Chicago. After Susan left promising to attend the council session, Henry drove Jacob to school. The boy was unusually quiet during the ride, staring out the window at the passing landscape. Penny for your thoughts? Henry asked. Jacob turned to him, his young face solemn. What if we win with the zoning and everything? Then we start building the future we talked about for Willow Ridge Farm, and I can stay with you. The question held all of Jacob's uncertainty about his place in the world. Henry felt a surge of protective affection for this child who had walked into his life during a blizzard and somehow become essential to it. That's the plan, Karen Foster says. Our home study is going well. If the financial situation stabilizes with the farm, there's a good chance for permanent placement. Jacob nodded, some tension leaving his shoulders. Good, because he want to stay. I like it here. I like having you here, Henry replied simply, the words inadequate for the transformation Jacob had brought to his life. The council's special session that afternoon was brief but conclusive. By a vote of 5-2, they approved the zoning variances Willow Ridge Farm needed to proceed with its heritage tourism plans. Mayor Phillips and Councilwoman Davis cast the dissenting votes, but the majority's decision was binding. Lawrence Brooks stormed out of the chambers immediately after the vote, not bothering to conceal his anger. Victor Reynolds approached Henry afterward, offering a conciliatory handshake. For what it's worth, the banker said quietly, I'm glad we found a solution that keeps the farm in your family. My father would have wanted that. As Henry drove home to share the news with Jacob, who had gone to Doris Palmer's house after school, he felt a weight lifting that he'd carried for years. Not just the immediate threat of foreclosure, but the deeper burden of failing to preserve what generations before him had built. The road ahead would not be easy. Transforming Willow Ridge Farm would require hard work, adaptation, and learning new skills. But for the first time in too long, the path forward held promise rather than despair. Arriving at Doris's farm, Henry found Jacob helping with the spring lambs, his clothes smudged with dirt, but his face alight with the simple joy of working with animals. The image struck Henry as a perfect representation of what they were fighting to preserve, not just land and buildings, but a way of life, a connection to nature and food and the rhythms of the seasons that no commercial development could replace. Well? Jacob asked anxiously, looking up as Henry approached. The pen Henry allowed himself a small smile. We won. The council approved our zoning requests. Jacob whooped with excitement, startling the lambs. He scrambled over the fence and threw his arms around Henry's waist. I knew it. I told you we could do it. Doris Palmer watched them with knowing eyes. Congratulations. Henry Farm's been saved, and it looks like you found something else worth saving too. Henry placed his hand on Jacob's shoulder, the boy's presence beside him, feeling increasingly natural, as if he had always belonged there. Yes, he agreed quietly. Believe I have 15 years later. New York City, 2025. The conference room on the 42nd floor of the Williams Technologies headquarters offered a panoramic view of Manhattan. Though Jacob Williams rarely took time to appreciate it anymore, at 27 he had grown, accustomed to the trappings of success, the corner office, the executive team that hung on his every word, the financial publications that tracked his company's meteoric rise. The quarterly numbers exceed projections by 17%. Jennifer Davis, his chief innovation officer, was saying as she flipped through slides on the massive display screen. Our agricultural technology division particularly outperformed expectations. Jacob nodded, making notes on his. Tablet Williams Technologies had begun as a software company, specializing in supply chain logistics, but over the years had diversified into agricultural technology, developing systems that helped small and medium-sized farms maximize efficiency while maintaining sustainable practices. The pilot program with family farms in Nebraska showed particularly strong results. Jennifer continued, 92% of participants reported increased yields with reduced resource consumption. At the mention of Nebraska, Jacob's hand moved unconsciously to his wrist where a silver pocket watch hung on a chain beneath his custom-tailored shirt cuff. The inscription inside had become his company's unofficial motto, though few knew its origin. Time passes. Love endures, as the meeting concluded. Scott Taylor, Jacob's business partner since their Stanford days, lingered behind, while the others filed out. Everything okay? Scott asked. You seem distracted. Jacob glanced at his calendar displayed on his desk monitor. I'm fine, just thinking about my trip tomorrow. Your mysterious annual pilgrimage to the heartland. Scott leaned against the doorframe. One day you'll have to tell me what draws the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar tech company to spend a week in rural Nebraska every March. Jacob smiled faintly. One day, maybe. After Scott left, Jacob moved to the window, gazing out at the city skyline. 15 years had transformed him from a grieving, displaced 12-year-old into one of the business world's rising stars. His journey from Millfield to this moment had not been straightforward. Social service had ultimately placed him with his Aunt Lisa, despite Henry's efforts to become his foster parent. The farm's financial situation, even with Ruth Simpson's investment, had been deemed too precarious by the county. Jacob had lived with Lisa in Grantham City until he graduated high school, but he had returned to Willow Ridge Farm every summer, and many weekends helping Henry implement the Heritage Tourism Plan. Those visits had kept him grounded during the difficult adjustment to his new life, and had shaped his understanding of what truly mattered in ways his peers could never comprehend. The intercom buzzed, interrupting his reflections. Mr. Williams, Maria Sanchez is here with your travel documents, his assistant announced. Maria entered, briskly placing a folder on Jacob's desk. At 32, she had been with him since Williams Technologies was a struggling startup operating out of a converted warehouse in Chicago. Her efficiency was legendary, her loyalty unquestioned. Your flight to Lincoln is confirmed for 9:00 a.m. I've arranged for a rental car and notified the usual hotel in Grantham City of your arrival. She hesitated. I also took the liberty of having Luis drive by Willow Ridge Farm yesterday. He says the place looks different. Jacob raised an eyebrow. Different? How? He wasn't sure. New signage, construction equipment. He didn't want to get too close since he was in an unmarked car. Jacob frowned. For the past decade, he had maintained a distance from Willow Ridge Farm at Henry's insistence. The old farmer had been adamant that Jacob focused on building his own future, not looking backward. Their communication had been limited to occasional phone calls and the annual week-long visit each March. Did Luis speak with Henry? Maria shook her head. He didn't see anyone on the property, but he did stop in Millfield and heard rumors that Midwest Development might be involved somehow. Jacob felt his chest tighten. Lawrence Brooks, the developer who had tried to take Henry's land all those years ago. That's not possible. Henry would never sell to Brooks. I don't have details, Maria said apologetically. But Luis thought you should know before you arrive. After Maria left, Jacob tried calling Henry's number but only reached the familiar voicemail greeting in the old farmer's gruff voice. He sent a text message, a communication method Henry had reluctantly adopted in recent years, but received no response. The uncertainty nared at him throughout the evening. Ash packed for his trip. By morning he had made a decision. Instead of the usual commercial flight to Lincoln, I instructed Maria to arrange for the company jet. He needed to reach Millfield as quickly as possible. During the flight, Jacob reviewed what he knew about Henry's recent situation. Their last conversation, just after Christmas, had been typical. Henry discussing the winter weather, sharing anecdotes about visitors to the farm, asking about Jacob's latest projects. He had mentioned feeling his age more lately, but had brushed off Jacob's concerns with his characteristic stubbornness. Had something changed dramatically in the past 2 months? Henry was 82, now still living alone in the old farmhouse. Despite Jacob's repeated offers to help hire assistants, the heritage farming operation had been reasonably successful over the years, turning Willow Ridge Farm into a modest attraction, but it would never generate significant wealth. If Henry needed money for medical expenses or farm repairs, he should have reached out. The thought that gnawed most persistently at Jacob was whether Henry might have suffered a health crisis. The old farmer was too proud to admit weakness, too independent to ask for help until situations became dire. When the jet touched down at the small regional airport near Grantham City, Luis was waiting with an SUV. The security specialist's expression confirmed that something was indeed amiss. "What did you find out?" Jacob asked as they pulled away from the terminal. Midwest Development has erected signs announcing a new project called Heritage Village on the eastern portion of Willow Ridge Farm. Lewis reported construction equipment arrived last week. The local paper ran a feature about it. Apparently it's being marketed as a living history attraction that will preserve the agricultural heritage of Millfield while creating modern amenities. And for visitors, Jacob clenched his jaw. That sounds like Brooks co-opting our original vision but with a corporate twist. Henry would never agree to that. "There's more," Louise said hesitantly. "I spoke with the waitress at the Millfield diner. She said Mr. Coleman had been hospitalized about 6 weeks ago. Heart problems." The news hit Jacob like a physical blow. Why didn't he call me? From what I gathered, it was serious. He might not have been able to step on it, Jacob said, his voice tight with worry. "We need to get to Millfield now." The landscape that unfolded outside the car windows was achingly familiar. The rolling plains, the distant farmhouses, the vast Nebraska sky that had always seemed bigger somehow than the one above New York. As they approached Millfield, Jacob noted changes to the small town. A new traffic light at Main Street. Several renovated storefronts, a modern medical clinic where the old doctor's office had been. The most jarring change came as they neared Willow Ridge Farm. Along the highway frontage, large signs proclaimed, "Coming soon, Heritage Village, a Midwest Development property." Behind theme, earth-moving equipment had already begun reshaping the eastern field where corn had grown during Jacob's summers there. "What the hell?" Jacob muttered, directing Luis to turn onto the farm's access road. The familiar driveway leading to the farmhouse remained unchanged, though the sign at the entrance had been updated to read, "Willow Ridge Farm Historic Agricultural Experience with Professional Graphics," replacing the hand-painted wood sign. Jacob remembered Luis parked near the house, which appeared well-maintained but showed no signs of activity. Jacob's knock went unanswered. Through the window he could see that the kitchen looked tidy but unoccupied, missing the usual signs of Henry's presence. No coffee mug on the counter, no jacket hung by the door. "He's not here," Jacob said, worry deepening. "Let's check the barn." The large red barn had been renovated years ago as part of the heritage tourism operation, with one section converted into a small museum of agricultural implements and another serving as a demonstration area for traditional farming techniques. Today it stood silent, though the equipment was clean and organized as Henry always insisted. "Mr. Williams." A female voice called from outside. Jacob emerged from the barn to find an older woman approaching from the caretaker's cottage, a structure built 10 years ago to house a seasonal help for the farm. "I'm Deborah Stone," she introduced herself. "I work part-time at Willow Ridge." "Are you looking for Henry?" "Yes." Jacob extended his hand. "Jacob Williams, I'm an old friend." Recognition dawned in Deborah's eyes. "Jacob, Henry talks about you all the time, the boy from the Blizzard who became a big-shot CEO." "Where is he?" Jacob asked, anxious to cut through pleasantries. Deborah's expression softened. "Millfield Medical Center. He had another episode last week. Dr. Wilson insisted he stay for observation this time." Without waiting for further explanation, Jacob and Luis returned to the SUV heading toward town. Jacob's mind raced with questions. What exactly had happened to Henry? Why was Midwest Development building on part of the farm? And most importantly, why had Henry kept all of this from him? The Millfield Medical Center was a modern one-story facility on the edge of town, a significant upgrade from the clinic Jacob remembered from his youth. At the reception desk, identified himself as Henry's family, a small lie that carried its own emotional truth. Room 112. The receptionist directed him, but he might be sleeping. Dr. Wilson adjusted his medication this morning. Jacob approached the room alone, having asked Luis to wait in the lobby. He paused in the doorway, his breath catching at the sight of Henry Coleman in the hospital bed. The robust farmer of Jacob's memory had been replaced by a frail figure, his face pale against the white pillows, thin arms resting atop the blanket with IV lines snaking into his veins. "Henry," Jacob called softly, moving to the bedside. The old man's eyes fluttered open, confusion giving way to recognition, then something like embarrassment. "Jacob, you're not supposed to be here until next week." Jacob pulled a chair close to the bed. "I heard rumors something was happening at the farm. Why didn't you tell me you were in the hospital?" Henry sighed, adjusting himself against the pillows. "Didn't want to worry you. You've got that company to run." "That's not an excuse." Jacob felt a surge of frustration. "I would have come immediately." "And what's this about? Midwest Development building on your land? Don't tell me you sold to Brooks after all these years." A flicker of the old fire appeared in Henry's eyes. "Not by choice. Had a massive heart attack in January. Doctor said I needed a triple bypass or I wouldn't see. Summer insurance wouldn't cover all of it." Jacob stared at him in disbelief. "You sold part of the farm to pay for surgery. Why didn't you call me? I would have covered any medical expenses." "Exactly why I didn't call," Henry retorted. "I've never taken handouts, not even from you." "It wouldn't be a handout," Jacob protested. "After everything you've done for me, that was different," Henry interrupted. "You were a child who needed help. I'm an old man who made his own choices." Jacob ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "So instead you made a deal with Brooks, the man who wanted to dig up your family cemetery 15 years ago?" Henry's expression turned defiant. "Only sold the east parcel, kept the homestead and cemetery, and I made him sign ironclad contracts about what kind of development he could build. This heritage village nonsense was the compromise." Jacob sat back, trying to process this unexpected turn of events. The Henry Coleman he knew had been willing to lose everything rather than sell to developers. What had changed? How bad was it, he asked finally. The heart attack. Henry's defiance faded, replaced by a vulnerability Jacob had rarely seen. Bad woke up on the kitchen floor, managed to reach the phone. Doctor said if the ambulance had been 5 minutes later, he left the sentence unfinished. Made me think about things differently. What things? Henry gestured vaguely toward the window where the Nebraska spring sunshine illuminated the hospital room. My stubbornness nearly got me killed. Started wondering what good it does to die with principles intact, if you die sooner than necessary. The admission clearly cost the proud old farmer. Jacob reached for Henry's hand, surprised at how fragile it felt in his grasp. You should have told me, Jacob said softly. Maybe. Henry studied Jacob's face. You look tired. New York working you too hard. The gentle redirection was so typical of Henry that Jacob had to smile despite his worry. I'm fine. The company's doing well. Our agricultural technology division is helping. Farmers across the Midwest implement sustainable practices while improving profitability. So I've heard your smart irrigation systems have been the talk of the county extension office. Pride warmed Henry's voice. You've done good, Jacob. Real good. Nurse entered to check Henry's vitals, informing them that Dr. Wilson would be making rounds soon. After she left, Henry gazed out the window again. Brooks offered 3 times market value for that section, he said abruptly. Enough to cover the surgery, rehabilitation, and set aside funds for the farm's continued operation made business sense. Jacob understood what Henry wasn't saying, that the decision had been agonizing a surrender of. Principles to practicality that cut against everything the old farmer believed. How much longer will you be here? Jacob asked, changing the subject. Doctor says maybe another week. Then rehabilitation at Millfield, assisted living for a month or so. Henry grimaced at the prospect. After that, back to the farm. Though they're insisting on a live-in caretaker, I'm staying until you're back home. Jacob said firmly, I'll postpone my meetings. Henry started to protest but seemed to reconsider the guest room's maid. Up, he said. Instead, Deborah keeps the place tidy. As Dr. Patricia Wilson entered for her examination, Jacob stepped into the hallway to give instructions to Luis and call Maria about rearranging his schedule. When he returned, he found Henry looking more alert, the doctor having apparently delivered good news about his recovery. Your grandfather is responding well to the medication, Dr. Wilson told Jacob with a smile. His strength is improving daily. Jacob didn't correct her assumption about their relationship in the ways that mattered most. Henry was indeed family. Perhaps the closest thing to a grandfather Jacob had ever known. Later that evening, after Henry had fallen asleep, Jacob drove back to Willow Ridge Farm alone. The old farmhouse welcomed him with familiar creaks and sigh as he moved through the rooms, memories surfacing with each step. James's bedroom, where Jacob had stayed during that fateful blizzard and many times afterward, remained largely unchanged, though it now featured a more modern bed and dresser than he remembered. On the nightstand sat a framed photograph that caught Jacob by surprise himself, at perhaps 14, standing beside Henry in front of the barn, both smiling, the silver pocket watch visible on Jacob's wrist. He had no recollection of the photo being taken, but the evident happiness on both their faces brought a lump to his throat. Jacob sank onto the bed, exhaustion from the day's emotional revelations finally catching up with him. Henry had sold part of the farm, an act that once would have considered unthinkable, to preserve his health and the core of his legacy. The compromise seemed symbolic of the man himself, pragmatic when necessary but principled at heart. Outside the window, the Nebraska night spread vast and star-filled over Willow Ridge Farm, much as it had that first night 15 years ago when a hungry boy and a lonely old farmer had found unexpected connection during a blizzard. The beginning of a story neither could have predicted, a story that Jacob was beginning to realize had reached another critical turning point. The following morning, Jacob woke to the familiar sounds of the farm, distant roosters announcing dawn, the gentle lowing of cattle in the pasture, the creaking of the old house as it warmed in the early spring sunshine. For a moment he could almost believe he was 14 again, preparing to help Henry with the morning chores before school. Reality reasserted itself as he checked his phone, finding dozens of emails requiring attention. The life he had built in New York continued its relentless pace regardless of his temporary absence. Jacob handled the most urgent matters before heading to the kitchen, where he was surprised to find Deborah Stone preparing breakfast. Hope you don't mind, she said, sliding eggs onto a plate. I come by most mornings to get things ready for when the farm opens to visitors. Been doing it since Henry's first hospital stay. Appreciate it, Jacob replied, accepting the offered coffee. How long have you worked? Here about 8 years now. Started part-time giving tours, then took on more responsibilities as Henry needed help. She sat across from him with her own coffee. He's stubborn about accepting assistance, as you probably know. Jacob smiled, wryly all too well. Deborah studied him with frank curiosity. Henry talks about you constantly. The brilliant boy who became a tech mogul but still remembers where he came from. I almost feel like I know you. What else has he told you about me that you stayed here after? Your mother passed away, that you helped save the farm from foreclosure. When you were just 12, that he tried to become your foster parent but couldn't due to the farm's financial situation." She paused. "He regrets that, not being able to give you a permanent." Jacob felt a pang of old sorrow. It wasn't his fault. The system had specific requirements he couldn't meet at the time, still weighs on him, says he let you down. The revelation surprised Jacob. In all their years of contact, Henry had never expressed such regret directly. Their relationship had bound its own rhythm. Despite the separation, the annual visits, occasional phone calls, holiday cards with Henry's sparse but heartfelt messages. After breakfast, Jacob explored the farm, noting changes that had accumulated over the years. The heritage tourism operation had evolved considerably from their initial concept. The barn museum had expanded to include interactive displays about sustainable agriculture. A small farm store sold produce, homemade preserves, and local crafts. The caretaker's cottage where Deborah lived had been complemented by 2 rustic guest cabins for overnight farm stay experiences. The contrast with the construction site on the eastern parcel was jarring. There, Brooks' Heritage Village was already taking shape, foundation outlines for structures designed to mimic historic buildings. But with modern amenities, signage promised an authentic agricultural experience alongside a shopping promenade, restaurants, and event spaces. Jacob approached a worker reviewing blueprints near the site entrance. "Excuse me, is Lawrence Brooks available, or anyone from Midwest Development?" "Mr. Brooks is at the Millfield office today," the man replied. "You might try there." The Midwest Development office occupied what had once been Millfield's hardware store on Main Street. The storefront had been remodeled with sleek modern lines that looked out of place among the town's weathered buildings. Inside, our receptionist directed Jacob to a conference room where Lawrence Brooks was meeting with Mayor Mark Phillips, apparently the son of the former mayor who had opposed Henry years ago. Brooks had aged his hair, now silver, but his expensive suit and commanding presence remained unchanged. Recognition flickered in his eyes as Jacob entered. "Jacob Williams," Brookie said, rising to extend his hand. "I wondered if you might appear when I heard about Henry's health issues." Mayor Phillips, this is the CEO of Williams Technologies, and Henry, Coleman's former ward. I was never officially his ward, Jacob corrected, shaking hands briefly. "I understand you've acquired part of Willow Ridge Farm." Brooks gestured toward the architectural renderings displayed on the conference room wall. "A mutually beneficial arrangement. Henry needed funds for his medical expenses, and we gained prime highway frontage for Heritage Village. The concept actually complements Willow Ridge Farm rather nicely. We handled the entertainment and retail aspects while the original farm maintains its educational focus." Jacob studied the renderings with skepticism. "It looks like you're essentially creating a theme park version of what Henry built, authentically over 15 years. We prefer to think of it as evolution." Brooks replied smoothly. "Henry's approach appeals to educational groups and history enthusiasts. Our development will attract a broader demographic with higher spending capacity. Mayor Phillips nodded enthusiastically. The economic impact projections are impressive. Heritage Village could transform Millfield's fortunes. And what happens to Willow Ridge Farm when Henry can no longer manage it? Jacob asked pointedly, especially with a flashier competitor right next door. Brooks smiled thinly. The purchase agreement includes first right of refusal should Henry decide to sell the remainder of the property. We have every intention of preserving the historic elements, particularly the family cemetery, which I know holds special significance. The calculated sincerity in Brooks's voice raised Jacob's suspicions in the purchase price. Was it truly fair market value, 3 times fair market value? Brooks corrected. Henry's medical situation created urgency. But I assure you we didn't take advantage. We respected his insistence on maintaining control of the homestead and cemetery areas. Jacob left the meeting unconvinced of Brooks' benevolent intentions. The developer had waited 15 years for this opportunity, and Henry's health crisis had finally provided the leverage he needed to gain a foothold on the property. At the Millfield Medical Center, Jacob found Henry sitting up in a chair looking stronger than the previous day. They spent the morning talking about the farm operations, carefully avoiding the topic of the Midwest development project until Henry himself broached it. You've seen Brooks' construction, I expect, he said, watching Jacob's expression closely. Yes, and I met with him this morning. Henry sighed. Never thought I'd sell an acre to that man. But circumstances change. You had other options, Jacob said gently. I would have helped. At what point does accepting help become dependence? Henry countered. I've lived my life on my own terms. Jacob made my own decisions, good or bad, and is this decision good or bad? Henry considered the question seriously. Both may be bad because it feels like a betrayal of principles, good because I'm still alive to feel bad about it. A wry smile crossed his face. Doctor says without the surgery, I'd have been in the family cemetery by Valentine's Day. The blunt assessment silenced Jacob's objections. Whatever his misgivings about Brooks' involvement, Henry's survival outweighed all other considerations. What happens now? Jacob asked instead. With the farm, I mean. Deborah manages the day-to-day operations when I'm not there. Peter Palmer, Doris's grandson, handles the agricultural side. The heritage tourism brings in steady income enough to maintain the place and pay the staff. Henry's expression turned reflective. But long-term, I haven't figured that out yet. Later that afternoon, Jacob received a call from Maria that required his immediate attention. A potential acquisition target was wavering in their commitment, and the board was pressing for his input. Reluctantly left Henry to handle the crisis via video conference from the farmhouse. 3 hours of intense negotiations. Later, Jacob emerged from the makeshift office in Henry's study to find Sheriff Frank Miller's son, Deputy James Miller, waiting in the living room. Mr. Williams, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's been an incident at the hospital. Mr. Coleman had another cardiac event about an hour ago. Jacob felt his blood run cold. How serious? Dr. Wilson stabilized him, but they've moved him to intensive care as a precaution. He was asking for you. The drive to the medical center passed in a blur of anxiety. Jacob found Henry in the ICU attached to more monitors than before, his complexion alarmingly gray. You're supposed to be resting, Jacob admonished. Gently taking the chair beside the bed, Henry's eyes opened. Slowly. Had to get your attention somehow. You were busy with your company. The attempt at humor failed to mask the severity of the situation. Dr. Wilson soon confirmed Jacob's fears. Henry had suffered a second smaller heart attack, indicating that the damage was more extensive than initially believed. We need to transfer him to Grand Anthem City Hospital for more specialized care. She explained their cardiac unit has capabilities we lack here. Whatever he needs, Jacob agreed immediately. I'll cover any expenses not included in his insurance. This time, Henry was too weak to protest the offer of financial assistance. As arrangements were made for his transfer, he beckoned Jacob closer. Need you to promise me something? He said, his voice barely above a whisper. Anything. If something happens, don't let Brooks get the cemetery or the house. Jacob squeezed his hand. Nothing's going to happen. You'll get through this. Henry fixed him with a stern look. Promise me, Jacob, the rest of the farm. Maybe it doesn't matter so much anymore, but those places, I promise. Jacob said solemnly. But this is just a precaution. You'll be back at Willow Ridge giving tours to school children before you know. A faint smile touched Henry's lips. Always were an optimist. As Henry was prepared for transport, Jacob stepped into the hallway to call Maria. I need you to have our legal team review something immediately. Find out what rights Lawrence Brooks of Midwest Development has to purchase the remainder of Willow Ridge Farm if Henry Coleman becomes incapacitated or passes away. The answer came back within the hour, and it wasn't reassuring. The contract Henry had signed gave Brookie's first right of refusal on any sale of the remaining property with specific clauses that would activate if Henry became unable to maintain the farm, or in the event of his death, Brooks had